The morning mist clung stubbornly to the rooftops of Loch Dhu, curling around the chimneys and drifting lazily down the cobbled streets. Hamish Macbeth, wrapped in his habitual tweed coat and scarf despite the lingering chill, had just stepped out of his small police office when Constable Blair came running, eyes wide and cheeks flushed from the cold. "Hamish, you'd better see this for yourself," Blair panted, fumbling with a piece of paper as he waved him toward the outskirts of the village. Hamish's brow furrowed. The village seldom offered him more than petty disputes and the occasional drunken scuffle. But there was urgency in Blair's tone, a tremor that spoke of something far graver. The crime scene was the McAllister cottage, a solitary house perched on the edge of the loch, its stone walls darkened by years of rain. Mrs. McAllister, a woman known for her meticulous housekeeping and genial disposition, had been found dead in the living room, a small package resting innocuously on her lap. The scene was deceptively ordinary, the fire crackling in the hearth, the kettle steaming on the stove, but the air was heavy with the unnatural. Hamish stepped closer, taking in the precise positioning of the body. Mrs. McAllister had been seated in her favourite armchair, upright, almost as if she'd been expecting company, and the package on her lap was wrapped neatly, tied with a crimson ribbon, as if someone had gone to the trouble of making her death look ceremonious. "What do you make of it, Hamish?" Blair asked quietly, following his gaze. Ish crouched, examining the package without touching it. There was no sign of forced entry, no overturned furniture, no indication of a struggle. The only unusual feature in the room was a single, small card tucked under the ribbon. He flipped it over with gloved hands. In elegant handwriting, the card read, "All gifts come at a price." The message was cryptic, unsettling, and utterly unhelpful. Hamish felt the familiar tug of a puzzle that didn't fit together yet demanded attention. He noticed other details as his eyes swept the room, the faint smell of almonds lingering in the air, the book Mrs. McAllister had been reading, left open to a passage about local folklore, and, most perplexing of all, the fireplace poker neatly resting against the hearth with a smudge of something dark at its tip. Perhaps soot, perhaps something else. Brr. E stood slowly, glancing at Blair. "It's staged," he said thoughtfully, his voice low, carrying more to himself than to anyone else. "Everything about this is too deliberate. Whoever did this wants it to look like a gift, but the gift isn't for her, it's for someone else. And that card," he shook his head, frowning. "It's meant to distract Blair swallowed nervously. "But who would want to—" Hamish cut him off gently. "That's what we need to find out." He moved to the window, gazing out at the still surface of the loch. Fog rolled over the water like a cloak, hiding the far shore in a cold, white mystery. No sign of anyone leaving or arriving, no footprints beyond the ones we can see. Whoever did this knew the layout perfectly and timed it carefully. He turned back to the room, noting the lack of a clear weapon. Poison seemed plausible given the almond scent, cyanide most likely, but he couldn't be sure yet. It would take careful examination. He crouched again, this time examining the carpet, the corners of the room, and the hearth more closely. Hamish's mind ticked over possibilities. The open window in the back, perhaps a servant, negligence, the neighbour who claimed to have seen shadows moving late last night. Every clue seemed small, insignificant, yet each could hold weight. And then there was the package itself. He had not yet untied it, yet he already sensed its purpose was not what it seemed. Whoever wrapped it had understood Mrs. McAllister's habits intimately, perhaps too intimately. Hamish's eyes drifted to the mantelpiece, where a photograph of the McAllisters' wedding smiled back at him. It was a scene of normality, happiness even, and yet the crime had intruded like a knife into the ordinary. He sighed softly, a sound more for himself than anyone else. Locked rooms, staged deaths, mysterious messages. These were the moments Hamish thrived in, yet each carried a weight that pressed upon him. He could feel it now, the tension of a puzzle that would not yield easily. "Hamish?" Blair's voice drew him back. "Es, Blair, He coroner said, "She's definitely dead, but there's something odd about her expression. almost peaceful, but not quite natural. But Mish nodded, already piecing together what he knew. Exactly. Someone has gone to extraordinary lengths. This isn't a random act of violence. It's meticulous, planned. And yet, there's an imperfection, a trace left behind that speaks louder than anything else in the room. That's our first thread to follow. Straightened, glancing again at the crimson ribbon, the card, the untouched tea on the stove. And that, Blair, is where we start. Sighed. The mist thickened, curling in at the edges of the window, as if the lock itself were guarding secrets too deep for ordinary eyes. Hamish felt the familiar surge of anticipation, the quiet thrill of a mystery that seemed unsolvable at first glance. Somewhere among the shadows of that mist and the carefully arranged scene inside, the truth waited, and Hamish Macbeth was determined to find it. Hamish returned to the cottage the following afternoon, the fog having lifted only partially, leaving a damp chill that seeped into the bones. Constable Blair was already on site, attempting to catalogue the scene with the thoroughness of a man trained more in procedure than in intuition. He moved with care, jotting down notes, photographing the room from every angle and asking perfunctory questions of the neighbours, who had gathered cautiously on the edge of the property. Their voices, hushed and nervous, floated through the still air, yet Hamish paid them little mind. He had learned long ago that the truth often hid in the details that no one else noticed. Hamish entered the living room quietly, his gaze sweeping over the familiar yet strangely unsettling arrangement. The crimson ribbon of the package seemed almost to shimmer under the muted light from the small window, an incongruous flourish against the sombre backdrop of death. He crouched again, examining the package, noting a faint indentation along one edge, as if it had been pressed carefully but unevenly. He gently tilted it, seeing nothing fall out but feeling the subtle weight shift. Whoever had prepared this gift had not merely wrapped it, they had thought about the presentation, the touch, the exact visual impression. A casual observer might have dismissed it as a quaint domestic detail, but to Hamish it spoke of meticulous planning. He rose and turned toward the mantelpiece, eyes lingering on a small brass clock, its hands frozen at 7:10. It had been dusted recently, yet a faint smear on the glass suggested someone had handled it hastily. Or had they tried to hide their intrusion? Hamish crouched again, this time examining the smudge more closely. It was almost imperceptible. Yet the angle of the streak suggested the hand that touched it was deliberate, calculated, possibly meant to mislead any investigator who happened to notice. He noted it in his mind. A thread to pull at later. Blair approached, holding a notebook awkwardly. Hamish, the neighbours said they didn't hear anything unusual last night. No footsteps, no shouting, nothing. Just silence. Hamish nodded, considering this. Silence was a weapon in the hands of a careful criminal. He let his gaze drift to the open book on the armchair, the passage about local folklore seeming oddly out of place now. He turned the pages slowly, noting pencil marks in the margin. A faint smudge of ink suggested the writer's hand had lingered unusually long over a single line, a story of betrayal and hidden motives among neighbours long feuding over land and inheritance. Hamish felt a flicker of understanding. The murderer might be drawing on stories from the past, using them to craft a tableau that hinted at something otherworldly or fated, yet all the while carefully orchestrating the mechanics of the crime. As he circled the room, his gaze fell upon a small, seemingly insignificant object on the windowsill, a silver thimble. It was out of place, an object too delicate and personal to be left behind accidentally. Hamish picked it up, examining it under the pale light. It bore faint scratches along its side, as if it had been hastily wiped clean. A detail invisible to Blair or the neighbours, but to Hamish it whispered of a hand that had lingered in haste or been interrupted. He pocketed it, thinking of it as the first tangible hint that someone was trying to manipulate appearances. Then, moving toward the door, Hamish noticed Mrs. McAllister's neighbour, old Mr. Mackintosh, lingering too close, his hands clasped nervously behind his back. He smiled at Hamish politely, but the twitch of his eyes and the way he shuffled his feet struck Hamish as peculiar. "Good afternoon, Mr. Mackintosh," Hamish said casually. "Did you notice anything unusual last night?" But Mackintosh's eyes darted briefly to the package, then away. "No, nothing at all. Just a quiet evening, really." But Hamish crouched slightly, lowering his voice. "Sometimes quiet evenings hide a lot, don't they?" The old man stiffened, muttering something about the weather, and Hamish straightened. He didn't accuse, not yet. He simply filed the odd reaction away. Deception often left its fingerprints on the smallest of gestures, the flicker of an eye, a faltering voice, a nervous shuffle. These were the threads a careful detective could follow, and Hamish had already found a few. Returning to the room, he studied the package once more. The bow was tied perfectly, the card deliberately positioned, yet one corner of the wrapping paper was slightly creased, as though it had been handled roughly or placed hurriedly. That crease, like the thimble, like the smear on the clock, was a subtle imperfection in an otherwise flawless stage set. Hamish smiled faintly to himself. The murderer had tried to control everything, yet left behind these small, telling traces. Hamish knew that this investigation would require patience, keen observation, and the willingness to see beyond the surface. The ordinary eyes of the constables and villagers would notice only the obvious: a death, a tidy scene, a cryptic card. But he would see the cracks in the veneer, the faint shadows of intent lurking behind the carefully crafted appearance. Somewhere amid these details lay the of understanding, the first whispers of motive and method. And Hamish Macbeth, as ever, would listen closely. Hamish spent the rest of the morning visiting the neighbours, moving slowly and deliberately, listening more than he spoke. Each witness seemed eager to offer their version of events, yet the eagerness itself struck him as peculiar. Mrs. McAllister's niece, Elspeth, arrived from Inverness, her cheeks flushed and her voice trembling with grief. She recited her routine faithfully. She had visited twice a week, found her aunt in good spirits last on Wednesday, and had seen nothing untoward on the path leading to the cottage. Yet as she spoke, Hamish noticed her hands twisting the strap of her handbag, a subtle tension in her posture. Small, perhaps, but telling. I just don't understand how this could happen," Elspeth said, her voice pitched a little higher than natural. Aunt Mary was careful, so careful. And this package, she gestured toward the memory of the gift. Hamish nodded thoughtfully, but he didn't comment. Emotional responses could be misleading, but physical cues rarely lied. Ext, he spoke with Dougal, the gardener who tended the grounds behind the cottage. Dougal was a taciturn man, more comfortable speaking with his hands in the soil than with words. "Didn't hear nothing, didn't see nothing," he muttered, scratching at the dirt under his fingernails. Night was quiet, fog thick, can't say more than that. His eyes, however, flickered to the package in Hamish's mind's eye, and Hamish caught a faint hesitation, a pause that didn't quite fit the straightforward words. There was something Dougal wasn't saying, something lodged between what he could admit and what he could not. From the corner of his eye, Hamish saw Mrs. McAllister's housekeeper, Agnes, hovering just outside the doorframe, her apron clean and pressed despite the cold. She's huffled forward when beckoned and began a careful, rehearsed account. "I went to bed early last night, as usual. Locked the doors, checked the windows twice. Heard nothing until Constable Blair arrived." Her voice was steady, almost too steady, and Hamish noticed how she avoided looking directly at him, instead focusing on a corner of the room as if some hidden memory were too delicate to confront. Hamish let them talk, observing the subtle dissonance in each story. Some details conflicted. Elspeth said she hadn't seen Dougal near the back door, while Dougal insisted he had been tending the garden in the very early hours, though the ground was too frozen for much work. Agnes claimed to have been upstairs when the first sounds occurred, yet a neighbour reported seeing her lantern flicker near the back porch. Nothing was blatant, nothing confirmed yet, but the contradictions piled up, each a shadow cast upon the truth. "What about Mr. Mackintosh?" Hamish asked casually, leaning on the doorframe of a neighbouring cottage where the old man had agreed to speak. "Did you see anyone suspicious?" But Mackintosh's hands twitched slightly in his pockets. "Suspicious? He paused, swallowing. Not really, just strange noises, I suppose. Could have been the wind, or an animal. His gaze flitted toward the direction of the McAllister cottage, then away. Hamish noted the way his voice faltered on the word strange, as if he was suppressing something more precise. Hamish stepped back, letting the silence stretch for a moment, allowing Mackintosh the space to fill it. The old man sighed, then shook his head. "Nothing more to say, Inspector." The choice of title amused Hamish privately. Villagers often used it loosely, but the distance it created was useful, even deliberate. By midday, Hamish had gathered fragments, disjointed and contradictory, yet each small piece shaped a pattern. He could sense even if the full picture remained murky. He returned to the cottage, his gaze scanning the familiar room anew. The package still rested where it had been left, untouched, the card glinting faintly in the sunlight filtering through the window. The bow, the crease in the paper, the thimble in his pocket, all these minor curiosities now felt more significant. He paced slowly, thinking aloud. "Everyone has something to hide," he murmured, almost to himself. "Some more than others. But deception leaves traces, and if you know where to look, those traces speak louder than words." Blair appeared, notebook in hand. "Did you learn anything?" he asked, hope and anxiety mingling in his voice. Hamish shook his head slowly, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his mouth. "Not the whole truth, Blair, but we have our first threads, small contradictions, nervous gestures, and the details no one else noticed. The story they tell isn't quite lining up, and where it doesn't, that's where the murderer hides. Outside, the loch shimmered under the pale winter sun, the gentle waves mocking in their calm. Yet inside the cottage, within the carefully staged scene and the careful words of witnesses, the subtle ripples of truth were beginning to show. Hamish felt the familiar stir of anticipation, the kind that meant the investigation was finally taking shape. And somewhere amid the half-truths and hidden motives he knew lay the key to unravelling the death wrapped like a gift. Hamish spent the afternoon sifting through the threads he had gathered, pacing the cottage with quiet deliberation. Each person he had spoken to carried a story, a motive perhaps disguised under layers of civility and grief. Motives, he knew, often revealed themselves in the smallest gestures, furtive glances, nervous twitches, words that stumbled over the truth. The more he thought about it, the more he realized that the crime was less about opportunity than about the tangled web of human desire. Elspeth's grief, though genuine in appearance, carried undertones of impatience. She was set to inherit a portion of her aunt's modest estate, yet she had recently argued with Mrs. McAllister over the sale of a small parcel of land that bordered her own property. Hamish recalled the margin notes in the book about betrayal and hidden grudges. The parallels were subtle but undeniable. Greed, quiet and polite, could masquerade as sorrow. Bardugal, the gardener, remained a puzzle. Taciturn and weathered, he spoke little of emotion. Yet the pause in his words, when asked about his whereabouts, spoke volumes. Hamish remembered the faint scuff marks near the back door, nearly invisible, but still present. A man who works with his hands all day leaves impressions everywhere. Could Dougal have stumbled upon something, or even played a part himself? The gardener's silence suggested a fear of exposure, or perhaps a loyalty that demanded secrecy. Agnes, the housekeeper, presented yet another layer of complication. She had been with the McAllisters for over a decade, a trusted member of the household, yet Hamish could sense an underlying tension. There had been disputes over minor sums, petty accusations of negligence, and whispers among villagers about her ambitions to remain indispensable. Her careful, rehearsed account of the night seemed too perfect, a pattern too neat for someone caught in the chaos of sudden violence. Was it fear, or calculated self-preservation? Hamish made a note to follow up with questions that might unravel her composure. Mr. Mackintosh, whose demeanour seemed harmless, was another thread in the growing maze. His sudden appearance at the window that night, his eyes shifting nervously when speaking of strange noises, hinted at a familiarity with more than just the Jenner. Rhythms of the village. Hamish considered the old man's pride in the past, his long memory of grudges, disputes over property boundaries, and a tendency to insert himself into neighbourhood affairs. Was it protection? Interference? Or something darker? Hamish returned to the open book and the card tucked into the package. All gifts come at a price. The phrase gnawed at him. It was not merely a message, but a statement of intention, a hint at motive. Someone had gone to the effort of creating a tableau, carefully controlling the appearance of the crime. Such planning implied a personal stake, a reason that mattered enough to orchestrate every detail. Yet every suspect, he considered, had reasons tangled in greed, jealousy, fear, or resentment. None of the motives alone accounted for the precision, the patience, and the theatricality of the crime scene. He jotted notes, mapping connections and contradictions. Elspeth and Agnes had both clashed over household decisions. Dougal had been in close proximity to both. Unseen yet observant, Mr. Mackintosh had ties to all three, through land disputes and casual village knowledge. Each connection added complexity rather than clarity, the web tightening around the truth yet refusing to reveal it outright. Hamish knew that this was the nature of human motive, rarely linear, often overlapping, and sometimes deliberately misrepresented. E paused by the window, watching the loch glint in the late afternoon sun. The fog had thinned, but its residue lingered in the low, rolling mist. Just as the water reflected light in fragments, so too did the puzzle reflect motives in pieces. One thing was certain. Someone had acted with intent, and the intention was anchored in personal stakes rather than randomness. The murderer had to be someone for whom the consequences mattered deeply, someone willing to manipulate appearances to hide their true. Purpose. Blair appeared quietly, handing Hamish a small notebook. "I've tracked everyone's alibis and movements over the past week," he said. "Nothing completely lines up, but there are gaps, places where their statements don't match observations." Hamish scanned the notes quickly, his mind weaving patterns. "Exactly," he said, a faint smile forming. "The gaps are more revealing than the stories. People tell what they think is acceptable, not what is true. And where truth and deception collide, that's where we find the motive." He set the notebook down, rubbing his chin thoughtfully. The tangled motives were beginning to form a picture, yet the puzzle was still incomplete. He could see the outlines, the shadow of intent behind every careful word, every subtle gesture, and amid the maze of greed, jealousy, and fear, there lay a kernel of truth waiting to emerge. Hamish felt the familiar stir of anticipation. The crime was solvable, but only if he could untangle the human web with patience, observation, and the relentless logic that had guided him through so many mysteries before. Somewhere in the interplay of motives, he knew, the path to the murderer would reveal itself. Hamish returned to the cottage late that afternoon, the fading light casting long shadows across the room. Constable Blair met him at the door, excitement barely contained in his voice. "Hamish, you need to see this." The coroner found traces of cyanide in the teacup on the stove. "That," he gestured toward the package, "that must have been the delivery method. The case is practically solved." Hamish looked at him steadily, his expression calm, almost too calm for Blair's eager anticipation. "Cyanide, yes," he acknowledged, "but practically solved? That's a phrase I don't use lightly." He crouched near the teacup, examining it without touching. A faint residue glimmered in the light, confirming Blair's observation. It was convincing, even damning to anyone who did not look further. Blair's eyes sparkled. "But surely that's all we need? A clear cause of death, and someone with access to the household could have done it. Anyone with opportunity." He practically vibrated with excitement, already imagining the headlines in the Inverness papers. Hamish remained silent for a moment, letting Blair's energy settle. He turned his gaze slowly toward the package, the ribbon still taut, the card still intact. Something about it unsettled him, though he couldn't put his finger on it just yet. He traced the crease along the paper with his eyes, recalled the thimble in his pocket, and the subtle smear on the clock. Each detail, seemingly minor, refused to align with the simplicity of a solved case. "Blair," he said gently, "don't let the obvious distract you. Cyanide is indeed a deadly poison, and yes, it could have been the method. But the question isn't just how she died, it's why this scene was arranged so deliberately. Why leave a card? Why stage a package so precisely? A killer who wanted to be caught would have done something far cruder. This is theatrical. There's more beneath it." Blair frowned, glancing at the cup and then back at Hamish. "But we have the poison. That's evidence. Isn't that enough?" Hamish shook his head slowly. "Not when other threads are still loose. Consider the witnesses, the contradictions in their stories, the motives we've seen. Someone could have used the cyanide as a red herring, leaving it in plain sight while the real purpose of the crime, control, fear, manipulation, remains hidden." As he spoke, Hamish's eyes were drawn again to the package. The card's message, the perfect bow, the slight crease, all of it seemed too deliberate to be mere decoration. His fingers itched to examine it again, but he held back, letting his mind work. The pieces fit neatly on the surface, almost too neatly. That was the danger, the false victory of an apparently solved case, a conclusion that felt satisfying to everyone except the one who saw beneath the illusions. He wandered to the window, gazing out at the loch, its surface catching the last rays of the sun. The calm reflected an artificial order, one carefully constructed. The real killer, he suspected, was still out there, perhaps watching the village settle into a premature sense of security. They had orchestrated a scene to mislead, to manipulate perceptions, to buy themselves time while others believed the crime solved. Hamish returned to the room and crouched near the fireplace, eyeing the poker with its faint smudge. A curious thought struck him. The poker had not been used, not for the attack, yet it had been deliberately positioned. A clue, or a distraction? Perhaps the same hand that had prepared the cyanide had arranged it to appear insignificant, masking a different purpose entirely. Blair, sensing his hesitation, leaned in. "Hamish, are you saying we're wrong?" Hamish stood slowly, a shadow of a smile crossing his face. "Not wrong, Blair. Just incomplete. The pieces we have are convincing, yes, but the story they tell is only part of the truth. There's a current running beneath the surface that we haven't traced yet, and until we do, the case isn't solved. It's only pretending to be." As night fell over Loch Dhu, the village seemed to exhale in relief, unaware that the danger lingered, unseen and patient. The murderer remained in the shadows, confident that the false victory would divert attention long enough for them to watch, wait, and perhaps plan their next move. Hamish felt the familiar tension in his chest, a mix of anticipation and unease. He had learned over the years that the calm before the storm was often the loudest warning. And somewhere, just beyond the circle of lantern light and the quiet streets, the true thread of the crime awaited discovery. Hamish turned back to the package one last time that night, the bow glinting faintly in the lamplight. It was a message, a challenge, and a warning all at once. He felt the pulse of the investigation quicken. This was far from over, and the real battle for truth had only just begun. Hamish spent the following morning in quiet reflection, poring over the village records and his own scattered notes. The cyanide seemed to offer an easy explanation, and many in Loch Dhu were already murmuring about the neat closure of a difficult case. But Hamish's instincts told him otherwise. There was a subtle tension in the way the clues aligned, or rather, how they didn't align perfectly. Something had been overlooked, a detail too small to matter on first glance, but large enough to fracture the whole narrative. As he leafed through old police reports, he stumbled upon a minor incident from nearly 20 years prior. A dispute over land had escalated in a nearby village, resulting in a mysterious fire that destroyed a farmhouse. No one had ever been charged, though suspicion had lingered around two families, one of which included Mr. Mackintosh. Hamish frowned, tracing the lines of the old report with his finger. The details were vague, but one name jumped out. Dougal's father had been a witness, and the fire had left a bitter legacy of resentment that no one had openly acknowledged. Slow smile tugged at the corner of Hamish's mouth. Connections that seemed trivial in the present now revealed themselves as threads woven years before, hidden in the quiet grudges of Loch Dhu's residents. The subtle tensions between Dougal, Mackintosh, and even the McAllister family were no accident. They were echoes of a past everyone had preferred to forget. Hamish scribbled notes furiously, linking the old fire, the disputed land, and the grudges simmering just beneath the surface. Returning to the cottage, he studied the package and the card again. The phrase, "all gifts come at a price," seemed less a cryptic threat and more a statement about consequences spanning decades. Someone was settling old scores, carefully orchestrating a tableau to punish and manipulate while presenting it as an isolated act. Hamish's gaze fell to the thimble in his pocket, the slight crease in the wrapping paper, and the faint smear on the clock. These small, seemingly inconsequential details suddenly felt like punctuation in a story written long ago and concluded only now. He summoned Blair to the office, spreading out a map of the village and the surrounding estates. "Look here," Hamish said, pointing to a series of properties, some inherited, some disputed. Years ago there were tensions over boundaries, over rights, over minor grievances that became major conflicts. The families involved kept their distance, but resentment lingered. Old alliances, old rivalries, they never really ended. They just hid under polite greetings and neighbourly conversation. Blair frowned, leaning in. "You think this crime is revenge for something that happened decades ago?" Hamish nodded. "Not just revenge. It's about control, about settling accounts in a way that others won't immediately recognise. Someone has studied the village, studied the people, and timed this carefully. The cyanide, the package, even the card. It's all part of a performance designed to mislead, to obscure the underlying motive. And that motive has roots that stretch back further than anyone suspected." As they spoke, Hamish's mind returned to the witnesses. Elspeth, Agnes, Dougal, Mackintosh. They were all connected. Whether by inheritance, by past disputes, or by old secrets they would prefer remained hidden. Each person's sut. The reactions, the contradictions in their statements, the gestures they thought went unnoticed, all made sense in light of this longer hidden narrative. The crime was not a sudden act of passion or opportunity. It was the culmination of years of grievances carefully orchestrated to appear spontaneous while hiding a much older purpose. Hamish rose and moved to the window, looking out at the loch shimmering under the late morning sun. The water seemed still, almost indifferent. Yet beneath its surface, currents moved unseen, shaping the landscape quietly over time, just as old grudges had shaped the village, unseen but powerful. He realized that to uncover the murderer, he would need to unravel not just the events of the past week, but the echoes of the past decades, tracing each subtle link and forgotten slight that had led to this moment. Returning to the package one last time that morning, Hamish studied it with renewed focus. It was no longer merely a present or a red herring, it was a message from history delivered with precision and intent. Somewhere within the complex web of human relationships, old rivalries and carefully concealed truths, the person responsible waited, confident that their past could shield them. Hamish felt the familiar pulse of anticipation and resolve. The shadows of the past had emerged, and now it was a matter of tracing them to their source before the next move could be made. Hamish spent the early evening in the cottage, the fire low and the room quiet except for the faint ticking of the brass clock. He had been reviewing his notes, retracing each witness's story, each contradiction, and the faint whispers of the past that now coloured every detail. It was clear that conventional questioning had yielded fragments, but nothing that could decisively point to murderer. He needed an approach that forced someone to reveal themselves without. Realizing it, a test of character, a psychological nudge that might expose the hidden crack in their careful facades, he decided to call Agnes, the housekeeper, back into the room. She entered hesitantly, smoothing her apron, her eyes darting briefly to the package on the armchair, as if it might leap from its place. Hamish offered a gentle smile. "Agnes, I'd like you to help me with something. Just a small exercise to understand what your aunt liked. You've been in her home for so long. You must know her routines intimately." She nodded warily, a flicker of relief crossing her face at the apparent simplicity of the request. Hamish continued, producing a small tray with an assortment of household items, teacups, a knitting pin, a thimble, and a small vial of harmless liquid, clearly labelled as "not toxic." "Tell me which of these your aunt would use at different times of the day, and what she preferred. No rush, just walk me through it." Agnes began carefully, describing the teacups, the teaspoons, the knitted pieces, speaking in a slow, measured cadence. Hamish listened, noting more than the words, the hesitation, the fleeting glance at the thimble, the way her fingers lingered on the vial. At first everything seemed routine. Then, as she reached for the thimble, a sudden flash of recognition and anxiety crossed her face. Her hand trembled slightly, and she set it down abruptly, muttering an excuse about dust. Hamish's eyes narrowed subtly, catching the imperceptible crack in her composure. "Interesting," he murmured, more to himself than to her. He pressed gently. "That thimble, you seem to recall it vividly. Did it play a particular role in your aunt's daily life?" Agnes hesitated, swallowing, her gaze dropping to the floor. I suppose it was hers." "For mending," she said finally, her voice tight. "Nothing more." But Hamish had already noted the sudden shift into Corneille, the sharp intake of breath, the avoidance of eye contact, the slight forward lean as if to shield something invisible. He allowed a beat of silence, letting her discomfort settle. Then he changed his tone, lightly, almost conversationally. "It's remarkable how small items can hold so much significance. Sometimes people treat them with care, sometimes with something else entirely." Agnes flinched at that subtle implication, and her shoulders stiffened. She looked around the room, as if seeking support from the objects themselves. Hamish did not push further. The goal was not confession. It was recognition of tension, a reaction betraying knowledge he had hoped to conceal. He made a small note in his notebook. The thimble was no longer just a household object. It had become a key to understanding hidden intentions. Blair, standing quietly at the side, whispered, "Did we just—" "Yes," Hamish said softly. "We just watched a carefully constructed composure crack. It's subtle, almost invisible, but it tells us more than any direct question ever could. Fear and guilt have a way of seeping through the smallest openings." Later, Hamish took a moment alone to reflect. The combination of the past grievances, the carefully staged scene, and now this reaction painted a picture that was growing more coherent by the hour. The murderer was someone intimately familiar with the household, someone who could manipulate appearances and yet was unable to completely mask the connection to the objects and routines of daily life. He returned the thimble to its place on the windowsill, deliberately leaving it in plain sight. It was a test, subtle and indirect, and he was certain that the true significance of that object had not escaped its keeper. Somewhere, behind the careful words, behind the polite gestures, lay the knowledge that the stage had been set, and someone's secret was beginning to unravel. Hamish felt the familiar pulse of anticipation, the thrill of watching human behaviour, of observing the unseen tremors of conscience and deceit. He knew that with patience the cracks in the façade would widen, and the story the witnesses had told so carefully would start to reveal the true hand that had orchestrated the death, wrapped like a gift. In the quiet of the cottage, the shadows of intent were beginning to stir, and Hamish, as always, was ready to follow them wherever they led. The following morning Hamish returned to the McAllister cottage, the chill of winter still lingering in the air. He had spent the night reviewing his notes, retracing connections, and considering the reactions he had observed, particularly Agnes's sudden unease around the thimble. The pieces were slowly coalescing, and he felt the familiar surge of anticipation that came when a case began to tip toward clarity. Yet as he approached the front door, an uneasy sense prickled at the back of his mind. Something was off. Inside, Constable Blair was already pacing, his notebook clutched tightly. "Hamish, you'll want to see this," he said, his voice taut. He led Hamish toward the armchair where the package had rested, and Hamish froze mid-step. The package was gone. The crimson ribbon, the neatly tied bow, the card, everything that had served as a focal point of the investigation had vanished. "What?" Hamish whispered, moving closer to the empty chair. His eyes darted around the room, noting the subtle disturbance in the dust near the windowsill, the slight scuff on the hearth, the faint smell of displaced air that suggested movement. Someone had entered after them, taken the package, and left with deliberate stealth. Lair ran a hand through his hair, his earlier excitement evaporating. But who? How? No one else has a key. Hamish knelt, examining the remnants of the scene. Crease in the wrapping paper, the faint smear on the clock, the thimble, all of it had been left behind, but the centerpiece of the crime, the package itself, had been removed. His mind raced through the possibilities: a witness trying to protect someone, a suspect attempting to erase incriminating evidence, or perhaps an opportunist seeking to manipulate the narrative entirely. The thief knew what they were taking, Hamish murmured. This wasn't random. Whoever did this understood the significance. They're trying to bury the truth before we can trace it. His eyes swept the room again, lingering on the objects that remained. The poker, the teacups, the carefully arranged furniture, all now served as a partial stage. Incomplete and slightly misleading. Blair swallowed nervously. Do we tell the others? The villagers are already gossiping. This could... He trailed off, unable to articulate the consequences. Hamish shook his head. Not yet. We observe. We gather more. Whoever removed the package may return, or they may reveal themselves in another way. Panic or exposure will force mistakes. Right now, trust is fragile, and the fewer people who know about this, the better. He moved to the mantelpiece, studying the clock again. The faint smear on the glass was unchanged, but in the empty space where the package had been, he noticed a subtle shift in the alignment of the shadows. It suggested someone had approached from the window rather than the door, a detail easily missed by a less observant eye. That route would explain the absence of footprints inside the room, the lack of disturbance elsewhere, and the rapidity with which the package had disappeared. Hamish then examined the thimble in his pocket. It was still intact, still offering the psychological clue from yesterday, but now it carried additional weight. It was a small piece of evidence, untouched, yet potent. Potentially the only tangible link to whoever had acted overnight. If he could connect the reactions he had observed to this act of removal, he might uncover the hand behind both the death and the disappearing package. Hours passed as Hamish and Blair retraced the perimeter of the cottage, questioning the neighbours under the guise of routine follow-up. Everyone insisted they had seen nothing, heard nothing, and no new arrivals had been noted. Hamish, however, noticed subtle signs: scuffed snow along the lochside path, a faintly displaced garden gate that hinted at a hasty, careful departure. The thief had planned the extraction, anticipating observation, and had executed it with quiet precision. Returning to the cottage once more, Hamish leaned against the window frame, watching the sun fall toward the horizon. The empty chair and the vanished package were stark reminders that the case was now not just a puzzle of motive and deception, but a contest of wits. Someone was deliberately working against him, manipulating evidence and controlling the narrative. The stakes had risen. Trust, always delicate in a village like Lochdu, now felt tenuous, fraying at the edges. Hamish felt the familiar thrill and tension intertwine. He knew the criminal was patient, intelligent, and confident, someone willing to interfere directly to protect their secret. And he knew, as always, that patience and observation were his allies. Somewhere in the shadows of the village, the package awaited, or perhaps it had already passed into new hands, but the act of its disappearance had spoken volumes. The real story had shifted, and Hamish Macbeth was determined to follow it, step by careful step, until the truth could no longer hide. Hamish was reviewing his notes late that evening, the low fire casting long shadows across the cottage, when a sudden knock at the door startled him. It was Blair, breathless and pale. "Hamish, you need to come quickly. There's been something at the McAllister boathouse." Hay hurried through the darkening streets, the loch reflecting streaks of moonlight, and as they neared the boathouse, a sense of foreboding settled over Hamish. The wooden structure, usually quiet and unremarkable, now radiated an eerie tension, the door ajar, swaying slightly in the cold breeze. Hamish's instincts bristled. Something had changed, and it wasn't subtle. Inside, the scene was chaotic. A small fire had been set, partially contained, casting flickering light across the walls, and the smell of smoke hung thick in the air. Amid the debris lay a figure, Mrs. McAllister's long-time friend, Miss Rowan, unconscious but breathing. She had been attacked, her scarf torn, a gash along her temple. Yet the most alarming detail was the absence of a crucial ledger that Miss Rowan kept, recording minor transactions and notes about village properties, a document Hamish had suspected might hold significance in understanding the underlying motives of the original crime. BRB. Eyre knelt beside her. "She's alive, thank goodness, but someone meant to silence her," he said, shaking his head. Hamish's eyes darted around the boathouse. The small, smashed windows bore faint fingerprints, not enough for identification yet, but enough to suggest deliberate entry. Scuff marks ran across the floorboards, leading to an overturned crate that had once held fishing supplies. And then he noticed it, a thin crimson ribbon caught on a nail, the same shade as the bow on the original package. His pulse quickened. Someone was signalling, mocking, or leaving a trail deliberately, daring them to follow. He rose slowly, crouching near the doorway to inspect the outside path. Footprints led toward the loch, then vanished, as if someone had been carried or had jumped into the water to evade pursuit. It was precise, calculated, an escape planned with meticulous foresight. The message was unmistakable. The villain was not only still at large, but several steps ahead, orchestrating events to manipulate fear and uncertainty. Blair looked up at him, alarmed. "Hamish, do you think they'll come after us next?" Hamish didn't answer immediately, his mind racing through possibilities. The attack was clearly meant as intimidation, a demonstration of power and reach. Whoever had orchestrated Mrs. McAllister's death and the vanishing package had anticipated every routine, every predictable move, and had now escalated. This was no longer simply an investigation. It was a contest of wits against someone bold, patient, and utterly ruthless. Returning inside, Hamish examined Miss Rowan carefully. Her eyes fluttered open, and recognition and fear crossed her face. They wanted the ledger," she whispered, her voice trembling. I didn't give it. I hid it, Hamish's gaze sharpened. "Where? I put it in the old storage shed, behind the false panel near the back," she murmured. "I didn't think they'd find it so soon." That revelation changed everything. The ledger, a previously overlooked piece of mundane record-keeping, now became central, a key to understanding both motives and the meticulous planning of the perpetrator. Hamish's mind raced as he pieced together the timeline, the initial murder, the disappearance of the package, and now the attack on Miss Rowan. Each act was carefully sequenced, not random, and each served a purpose in controlling the narrative, manipulating fear, and concealing the true intent of the criminal. Hamish rose and looked at Blair. "We have to secure that ledger before anyone else can get to it. Whoever is behind this is escalating, and if we don't act carefully, they may strike again, and not just at witnesses." Outside, the moon glimmered off the surface of the loch, calm yet deceptive. The night carried the sense of a predator in motion, silent and deliberate. Hamish felt the familiar tension tighten in his chest, the mix of anticipation and danger that always preceded the breakthrough in a case. The stakes had risen dramatically. This was no longer a matter of solving a past murder, it was about preventing the next, tracing the unseen hand that orchestrated every event, and staying one step ahead of a criminal who thrived in shadows. He glanced once more at Miss Rowan, the faint tremor in her hands, the fear in her eyes, and the urgency in her words. The case had taken a sharp turn, and Hamish knew instinctively that the true game had only just begun. The villain was out there, moving carefully through the darkness, and now it was not just the past he needed to unravel, but the immediate threat that loomed over every corner of Loch Dhu. The night after the attack on Miss Rowan, Hamish returned to the cottage alone, the chill of the loch air trailing behind him. The village had settled into uneasy quiet, but he could feel the tension lingering in every shadowed corner, in every shuttered window. The attack had escalated the stakes, yet amidst the chaos, Hamish knew that clues often revealed themselves when the noise of panic faded. He spread his notes across the small table, rereading every account, every observation, every subtle gesture. He returned in his mind to the first visit to the cottage, the package, the crimson ribbon, the thimble, and the card. Each had seemed an isolated curiosity at the time, but now they felt like deliberate markers, parts of a rhythm only visible if one observed carefully. Hamish's gaze fell on the thimble, still lying where he had placed it. The earlier psychological test with Agnes had revealed her unease, her subtle reactions betraying knowledge she wished to conceal. He considered the ledger, the vanishing package, and the attack at the boathouse. Each act seemed discreet, yet there was a cadence, a deliberate sequencing. Hamish thought back to the offhand comments from the villagers, the fleeting remarks about old land disputes, minor grievances that had seemed inconsequential, the subtle hints of past rivalries. The old grievances, the land, the neighbours' quiet rivalries, the careful positioning of objects in the cottage, they all pointed to someone who understood the village intimately, who could anticipate every move, and who relished orchestrating events to appear random while leaving a pattern for those perceptive enough to notice. It was the pattern itself that had eluded him until now. The crimson ribbon appeared not just on the package, but had left its mark at the boathouse. The thimble was more than a domestic artifact. It had been a signal, a trigger for the psychological reaction Hamish had observed. Even the crease in the wrapping paper now seemed deliberate, placed to guide the eye, to direct suspicion's soot, to suggest randomness while concealing intent. Hamish traced a line with his finger across the notes, connecting the moments, the first death, the conflicting alibis, the old grievances, the disappearing package, the attack, the ledger, all connected through a subtle thread of signals, indications, and manipulations. The villain had been moving with precision, guiding perceptions, planting clues that were half-truths, designed to mislead as much as to reveal. He leaned back in his chair, a faint smile tugging at his lips. The key had been under his nose all along, obscured by the apparent chaos of human emotion and the ordinary bustle of village life. The offhand comments, the minor discrepancies in statements, the subtle placement of objects, they were all pieces of a language the criminal used to communicate with themselves and to manipulate others. Hamish realized that the true genius of the perpetrator lay not in violence but in control, in the orchestration of perception. Blair appeared at the door, his expression a mixture of fatigue and hope. "Have you figured it out?" he asked cautiously. Hamish nodded slowly, gathering his papers. "Yes, Blair. The pattern is here, woven into everything we've seen. It's a sequence of actions and reactions, deliberate enough that the unobservant would miss it entirely. The villain has been leaving themselves exposed in plain sight, confident that no one would see the connections until now." He moved toward the window, peering out at the calm loch. The stillness belied the calculated chaos that had been unfolding in the village for weeks. Each step of the criminal's plan, each seemingly isolated act now fell into place. The attack at the boathouse, the stolen package, the faint smears and displaced objects, they were all elements in a narrative designed to distract, to intimidate, and to test the vigilance of anyone who might. "Follow." Hamish returned to the thimble one last time, holding it delicately between his fingers. It had seemed insignificant, almost trivial, yet it had been the trigger, the small constant in a web of deception. The criminal had underestimated the subtlety of observation, the persistence of a mind trained to see beyond appearances. As he set the thimble back down, Hamish felt the familiar pulse of anticipation. The pattern was clear, the strategy of the murderer evident, and the next steps, though dangerous, could now be planned with purpose. The chaos had been a smokescreen, but the method beneath it all had emerged. For the first time the case felt within reach, not just in theory, but in the tangible, deliberate sequence of clues and reactions that pointed to the mind behind the death wrapped like a gift. Hamish sat alone in the quiet of the cottage, reviewing his notes once more, each observation, each contradiction laid out like a map of human behaviour. The pattern had emerged, subtle yet undeniable, and now it was only a matter of following it to the root of the crime. He thought again of the thimble, the crimson ribbon, the vanishing package, and the attack on Miss Rowan. Each had been a message, a signal, a psychological marker designed to control perception and manipulate reaction. But there was still one missing piece, a motive that made sense of the meticulous orchestration, the patience, and the escalation. He recalled the offhand comments from villagers about decades-old grudges, whispered tales of disputes over land and inheritance, and the resentment simmering quietly beneath polite greetings. Yet none of these explained the artistry of the crime, the careful staging, or the audacity of attacking Miss Rowan. Money and property could explain resentment, jealousy could explain malice, but they could not account for the obsessive attention to detail, the precise choreography, and the deliberate manipulation of fear. Hamish leaned back, letting his thoughts flow like the lock outside the window, tracing connections he had overlooked. Then it struck him, the ledger. Miss Rowan had hidden it, and its contents were far more telling than anyone realized. It wasn't just a record of mundane transactions. It contained notes, observations, and secrets that spanned years. There were references to minor betrayals, gossip, and hints of old transgressions, but among them lay an unexpected thread: personal humiliation, carefully documented slights, instances of perceived disrespect that had festered into obsession. The villain hadn't acted purely for gain or vengeance. They had acted to regain control over a narrative, to rewrite the story in their favor, to assert dominance over a perceived hierarchy of insult and slight. Hamish's mind returned to Agnes, whose reactions had betrayed her in the thimble exercise. She had lived for decades under what she perceived as the shadow of the McAllisters, the slow erosion of influence, the tiny humiliations that built day by day. And yet, it wasn't just her. The subtle cues in the behavior of others, the orchestrated chaos, the selection of objects, and the staging of the crime, it all pointed toward a singular obsession with control, with psychological domination rather than material gain. He understood now why the package had been left with the card, why the ribbon had been placed deliberately, why the cyanide seemed like an obvious method but was carefully misleading. The villain had sought not merely to kill but to choreograph terror, to manipulate perception, to make each participant complicit in the drama without realizing it. Their satisfaction came not from the act itself, but from the mastery of the situation, from the orchestration of every movement, every reaction, every tiny detail. It was a crime committed with the precision of a conductor, each witness a note in a symphony of fear. Hamish's eyes narrowed as he recalled the attack on Miss Rowan. That act had not been impulsive. It was deliberate, a test, a provocation, a demonstration of control. The criminal had escalated the stakes to gauge the reactions, to pressure those around them, and to observe how the threads of their careful web responded under duress. Each action had been both punishment and experiment, revealing not just the weaknesses of the victims, but the depths of the villain's compulsions. He glanced at Blair, who had been quietly reviewing the perimeter reports. "It's more than greed, more than revenge," Hamish said quietly. "This is about control, obsession with dominance over perception and consequence. The crime was designed to manipulate, to choreograph, to prove superiority over those who had slighted them in their own mind. And that explains everything: the package, the stolen ledger, the stage scenes, the attack at the boathouse. All of it was part of a psychological design." Blair's eyes widened. "You mean it wasn't about money?" "Money was a backdrop, Blair," Hamish replied. "Opportunity a convenience. But the driving force, the true motive, was the need to assert power over perception itself. This is a person who cannot tolerate ambiguity, who measures the world in their own terms, and will go to extreme lengths to orchestrate events to prove their control." The room was silent except for the faint tick of the clock. Outside, the lock shimmered under the cold moonlight, calm yet indifferent to the turmoil in the cottage. Hamish felt a chill, the recognition of the depths of human obsession, the lengths to which someone would go to impose their narrative on the lives of others. The crime had always been personal, but now he understood why it had been so meticulously executed, why it had escalated so precisely, and why the pattern had been so carefully hidden in plain sight. Hamish stood, a quiet resolve settling over him. The villain's psychology had been exposed, and with that understanding came power, the power to predict, to anticipate, and to confront. The true motive, shocking in its obsession and cunning, was now illuminated, and the path to bringing the orchestrator of terror to justice had finally begun. Hamish spent the next morning preparing meticulously, knowing that the culmination of weeks of observation, deduction, and careful reasoning had led him to a single point. The pattern, the the subtle clues, the psychological tests, and the ledger all pointed unmistakably toward one person. Every interaction, every reaction he had observed, now fit into a precise framework. The final confrontation would require patience, composure, and the subtle manipulation of the suspect's own obsessions against them. He gathered Blair and outlined the plan quietly, his voice steady and calm. They would stage a meeting at the McAllister cottage, presenting the ledger as if discovered but subtly arranging it so that the criminal believed their careful control over the narrative had been maintained. Every movement was choreographed to provoke just enough anxiety to crack the veneer of composure, to coax the truth from a mind too obsessed with control to resist manipulation. Why mid-afternoon the suspect arrived, Agnes. She entered the room with her usual careful precision, smoothing her apron and avoiding Hamish's gaze. Blair remained near the doorway, keeping discreet watch, while Hamish motioned for Agnes to sit at the table where the ledger rested, open and exposed. "Thank you for coming, Agnes," Hamish said, his tone gentle but deliberate. "I thought you might like to review the ledger yourself, see what Miss Rowan remembered and recorded." He let his eyes linger on her hands, then on the small objects still scattered around, the thimble, the poker, the teacups, all familiar markers she had interacted with during the earlier psychological test. Agnes's fingers twitched subtly as she glanced at the ledger. I didn't take it. I would never." Her voice faltered, the rehearsed calm of her earlier statements slipping for the first time. Hamish leaned forward slightly, softening his tone. "Of course not. I know you wouldn't take it in the sense you think of theft. But someone moved it, didn't they? Someone who wanted to control the narrative, to orchestrate events carefully, just as they did with the package, with the attack, and with the rest of everything." Agnes's eyes darted toward the package, then the thimble, then the ledger. Her breathing quickened, subtle beads of sweat forming at her temples. She gripped the edge of the table as if it could anchor her. "It wasn't supposed to. I didn't mean—" Hamish's gaze was calm, unrelenting. "You've been living under this perceived shadow for years, Agnes. Every slight, every imagined humiliation, it festered. You believed control was yours only when others obeyed the choreography you set, when your environment and the people in it moved according to your expectations. You orchestrated the package, the cyanide, the staged scenes to assert that control, and when someone threatened to unravel it, you acted again." Her hands trembled as the weight of his words sank in. The obsession, the compulsion for control, the meticulous planning, all now lay exposed. She looked at the objects around her, the familiar cues Hamish had so deliberately left in place, and finally the façade cracked. I didn't mean for anyone to die," she stammered, her voice shaking. It was supposed to scare them, to make them listen, to prove I mattered." Her eyes welled with tears as the admission spilled forth, raw and unfiltered. "I wanted to show everyone, I was in charge." Hamish's expression softened, but his composure remained firm. "And yet, control came at a cost," he said quietly. "Someone is dead, others were attacked, and you underestimated the power of observation and patience. The pattern was always visible to someone who chose to see it. That someone is me, Agnes. The case is complete now, but justice must follow." For a moment, silence hung in the room, broken only by Agnes's ragged breaths. Then, with a resigned slump of her shoulders, she allowed the truth to settle, her desperate defiance fading into acceptance. Hamish had anticipated no escape, no last-minute trickery. The evidence, the psychological cues, the pattern, and the ledger itself had cornered her perfectly. Blair stepped forward gently, securing her without aggression. Hamish watched the interplay of relief, fear, and lingering obsession cross her face. The villain, so confident in control, had been undone by the very structure they had relied upon. The pattern, now fully revealed, had become inescapable. As the door closed behind them, Hamish allowed himself a quiet breath, the tension that had defined the past weeks finally easing. The intricate web of deception, obsession, and manipulation had been unravelled, and the orchestrator of the crime wrapped like a gift had been brought into the light. He knew the village would soon begin to recover, the shadows receding, Yet the echoes of calculated obsession would linger, a reminder that even the quietest places could harbour the most meticulous of crimes. The following morning, Hamish returned to the cottage alone, the quiet of Loch Dew enveloping him in a deceptive calm. Agnes had been taken into custody, and the village had begun to whisper of closure, of a case neatly resolved. Yet as Hamish moved through the familiar rooms, the weight of unease pressed at his mind. Something still didn't fit. Small, nearly imperceptible details that refused to settle into the tidy narrative he had pieced together. He paused by the window, the loch shimmering under a pale sun. His eyes fell upon the package's original resting place, now empty, and the thimble still on the sill. It all seemed as it should, except for one small anomaly. The ledger, the crucial piece of evidence that de-exposed Agnes's obsession and driven the final confrontation, had a page slightly crumpled, the corner torn as if someone had read it in haste. Hamish frowned. Agnes had been careful, meticulous, even obsessive. She would never leave such a mark. His mind replayed the previous days. Agnes's reactions, the vanished package, the attack on Miss Rowan. Each act had been deliberate, calculated to manipulate perception. But who else had access to the cottage? Who had been present in the periphery, watching, listening, and waiting for the right moment to act? Hamish's eyes drifted to the fireplace, the faint scuff marks on the floorboards, the subtle shift in dust near the doorway. He remembered the first morning he arrived, the constable's eagerness, the villagers' offhand comments, and then it clicked. The real mastermind had never been under direct suspicion, had operated quietly, patiently, and with the confidence that others' obsessions would mask their own. Hamish retraced the interactions with Blair, noting each suggestion, each moment of eagerness to assert authority. Blair had been an invaluable assistant, yet Hamish's instincts prickled. Something about his behaviour, the slight hesitation when the ledger was mentioned, the way he had lingered by the boathouse path, the almost imperceptible flinch at the mention of the package, had never sat right. It wasn't malice, not in the obvious sense, but calculation. Hamish leaned over the table, examining the ledger again, and noticed that a few entries had been subtly altered, numbers crossed out, dates shifted, minor notations erased. Small, almost invisible, but deliberate. The realization struck with clarity. Agnes had acted obsessively, yes, but she had been manipulated. Someone had orchestrated events around her, using her compulsions to carry out acts that they themselves had planned, remaining in the shadows while all, owing the village, and even Hamish, to follow the more obvious thread. The real criminal had been several steps ahead from the beginning, orchestrating both the deaths and the chaos with surgical precision. Hamish's pulse quickened, but his voice remained calm as he stepped outside, the cold loch air sharpening his focus. The true culprit was closer than anyone suspected, someone trusted, someone underestimated, someone who had subtly nudged Agnes, guided the sequence of events, and ensured that attention remained fixed on the wrong person. He traced the route from the cottage to the village, then to the boathouse, noting subtle signs, a footprint here, a displaced garden tool there. The faint scent of tobacco, not Agnes's, lingering in the shadows. Blair emerged from the village path, holding the ledger nervously. "Hamish, I found a discrepancy," he said, voice trembling. "A few entries. They're not hers. I thought maybe I was seeing things." Hamish's eyes met his, steady and unflinching. "You weren't seeing things, Blair. Someone has been guiding the narrative, using the very obsession we exposed to their advantage. The crime wasn't only Agnes's doing. She was a pawn, carefully positioned to mislead, while the true hand remained unseen." Blair's face paled, the weight of the accusation dawning, but Hamish's gaze was not accusatory. It was the piercing calm of observation, of certainty born from careful deduction. The final twist had arrived. The mind behind the meticulously orchestrated terror had been hidden in plain sight, confident that attention would remain elsewhere, certain that their manipulations would never be traced. The loch stretched before them, calm, reflecting the pale winter sky. Hamish felt the familiar tension tighten in his chest, the thrill of revelation, the knowledge that the case was far from over, and that he would need every ounce of patience and pretty cunning to expose the final, unexpected architect of the tragedy wrapped like a gift. The game was not yet complete, and the real confrontation, the unveiling of the true mastermind, was only just beginning. Hamish moved silently through the village streets as dusk settled over Loch Dhu, the crisp winter air carrying the faint scent of smoke from hearths and the loch's cool mist. The unsettling revelation from the previous morning weighed heavily on him. Agnes had been the visible villain, but the real orchestrator of chaos had remained hidden, a puppeteer pulling strings from the shadows. Everything, the package, the cyanide, the boathouse attack, had been carefully staged to manipulate perception, relying on Agnes's obsessions as a smokescreen. Now it was time to draw the trap that would force the final act. He returned to the McAllister cottage, setting the ledger deliberately on the table where it would be noticed. Small cues remained in place, the thimble, the teacups, the slightly askew poker, all subtle markers to provoke recognition and anxiety. He sent a discreet message to the village constables, leaving instructions to observe without intervening. Hamish had learned long ago that the right measure of patience often revealed more than immediate confrontation. As twilight deepened, a figure approached the cottage. Hamish's eyes narrowed. Every step, every pause was calculated, as if the person moving through the fading light knew the terrain intimately. Blair, positioned discreetly outside, whispered, "Hamish! It's him, bruh." His suspect entered the room, expression carefully neutral. The aura of confidence was unmistakable. Someone used to being in control, someone who had relied on manipulation and misdirection for weeks. Hamish let the silence stretch, letting the weight of the prepared scene settle over the intruder. "Good evening," Hamish said softly, his calm tone belying the intensity of the moment. "I was wondering when you would come." The suspect froze for a fraction of a second, subtle enough that anyone else might have missed it, but Hamish caught it immediately. The twitch in the hand, the quick dart of the eyes to the thimble, the ledger, then back to Hamish. A flicker of recognition crossed the confident mask. "You know why I'm here," the intruder said cautiously, voice steady, though the tension beneath it was palpable. "Yes," Hamish replied, moving closer. "You've orchestrated everything, haven't you? The package, the cyanide, the attack on Miss Rowan, all carefully staged to manipulate perception. Agnes played her part willingly, but she was never the mastermind. You counted on her obsessions to distract everyone while you remained unseen." A muscle in the suspect's jaw tightened. "You can't prove it," came the calm, deliberate reply, but Hamish detected the fissure beneath the veneer. "Proof is often a matter of observation," Hamish said, gesturing to the ledger, the thimble, and the other subtle cues. "You altered entries here, guided her reactions, left deliberate markers for me to follow. Every seemingly minor detail, the crooked poker, the ribbon left behind, the smudges on the clock, they were your signature. You underestimated the patience of observation and the persistence of deduction. The intruder's composure faltered for a heartbeat, then they made a sudden move, a desperate lunge toward the window, as if to escape. Hamish was ready, the door was closed, Blair positioned strategically, and the trap was complete. With calm authority he blocked the route and stepped forward. "There's no need for that. The pattern has been clear for days. The evidence, the ledger, the sequence of reactions, it all points to you. The game ends here." The suspect hesitated, then slumped into a air, the tension leaving their body in slow surrender. Hamish allowed a moment of silence before speaking again. "This village, quiet as it seems, reveals everything to those who watch closely. You relied on others' obsessions, their predictability, but you forgot one thing. I observe without distraction, and I follow the invisible lines that connect each act. That is why justice, though delayed, cannot be denied." Blair entered, carefully guiding the suspect outside to the waiting constables. Hamish followed, his gaze scanning the village, the loch, the faint light of windows where the inhabitants went about their lives, unaware of how close chaos had come. Agnes had been caught in a web not entirely of her own making, and the true villain had finally been exposed, but the subtle manipulations, the psychological intricacies, and the sheer audacity of the plot left a lingering unease. As the suspect was led away, Hamish returned to the cottage one last time, setting the thimble and other markers in their original places. The village exhaled, the immediate danger past, Yet the echoes of obsession, control, and meticulous calculation remained. He reflected on the clues that had been overlooked, the slight hesitations, the altered ledger entries, the deliberate placement of ordinary objects, and smiled faintly. Once again, patience, observation, and the willingness to see what others missed had allowed him to stay one step ahead. Justice had been served, yet the case left behind a subtle, unsettling lesson. Even in the quietest of villages, human obsession and cunning can hide in plain sight, waiting for the right observer to unravel the truth. Hamish walked slowly along the edge of Loch Dhu. As dawn began to break, the cold air crisp against his cheeks, and the faint mist curling over the water in delicate tendrils, the village behind him was waking to the quiet hum of daily life, unaware of the orchestration, the obsessions, and the long, careful unravelling that had taken place in the previous days. Agnes had confessed, the true mastermind exposed, and the ledger had been secured. Yet as Hamish followed the loch's winding path, a subtle unease lingered at the edge of his thoughts. The case had been complex, layered with psychological manipulation, carefully staged misdirection, and deliberate deception. He had watched, observed, and waited until the web of actions and reactions revealed its pattern. And yet, something felt incomplete. A minor detail, almost insignificant at first, had refused to settle in his mind. The ledger had been altered in ways that went beyond simple entries. The faint smudge on the bottom corner of a page, almost imperceptible, as though someone had traced a symbol or initial before wiping it away. At the time he had focused on the bigger picture, on Agnes's obsession and the orchestration surrounding her. But now, in the quiet of the dawn, the subtle mark whispered a question he could not ignore. He stopped near the old pier, peering at the loch's still waters, the reflection of the pale sun fracturing across gentle ripples. The pattern had been revealed, the psychological motives laid bare, the manipulations exposed. Yet the faint symbol in the ledger suggested one more message, one last communication meant to elude the casual observer. Was it a warning, a signature, or a playful taunt from someone who had enjoyed watching the chaos unfold? Hamish could not tell, and that uncertainty stirred a familiar thrill. A mystery, even when ostensibly resolved, never truly ended. His thoughts drifted to the villagers, Miss Rowan, Agnes, Blair, and the McAllisters themselves. Each had played their role, consciously or unwittingly, in the drama that had enveloped the quiet streets and cottages. The loch, ever present, seemed to hold the echoes of every subtle act, every calculated move, every misstep and observation. Hamish had always believed that in a village like this, the ordinary concealed extraordinary secrets, and the faintest irregularities could reveal truths invisible to most. As he walked, his mind catalogued the lingering uncertainties. The minor smudge, the precise disappearance of the package, the unusual timing of certain observations, all details that had seemed peripheral but might yet carry meaning. He smiled faintly, the expression more thoughtful than amused. Some mysteries were resolved only to reveal new questions, and the delicate balance between closure and curiosity was one he had learned to respect. Hamish paused near the bridge, where the water ran swift and cold beneath its arch, lifting his gaze to the distant hills shrouded in mist. The village lay behind him, the cottages warm and bright with morning light, yet the world ahead remained uncertain, full of quiet corners and subtle movements that could hide another mystery at any moment. He adjusted his coat, the chill pushing him forward, and took a final look at the loch. The evidence had spoken, the case concluded in the minds of most. Yet Hamish knew the truth was never so simple. The faintest smile tugged at his lips as he began walking back toward the heart of Loch Dhu. The village would settle into its routines, the memory of recent events fading like footprints in snow. But the detective's mind remained alert, attuned to irregularities, contradictions, and the small signs of human obsession that often went unnoticed. One detail might yet unlock another mystery. One seemingly trivial mark could reveal a new sequence of events waiting to unfold. And so Hamish Macbeth moved through the village, calm yet vigilant, the echo of recent chaos still fresh in his thoughts. The case was complete in its outward form, but the faint smudge, the cryptic ledger mark, and the lingering questions reminded him, and the observer of his tale, that, in a world as intricate and quiet as Loch Dhu, a mystery never truly ends. Somewhere, in the subtle movements of shadows or the whisper of an overlooked gesture, another puzzle waited patiently, and Hamish, as always, would be there to follow it wherever it led.